In the cozy wooden house nestled in the quiet suburbs of Cedar Ridge, Ohio, the scent of honey-glazed ham filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of Christmas music from the old radio on the kitchen counter. Everything seemed perfectly festive. The glittering tree, the polished dinnerware, and the muffled giggles of children beneath the table. But for Evelyn Carter, 26 this Christmas would become the moment everything she believed about family would begin to unravel. She sat between her parents and her older brother in her usual spot beside the fireplace, a seat that had been hers since childhood. Back then, it had felt like the safest place in the world. Today, though, the lights still blinked on the stair railing, and the scent of cinnamon still lingered in the air, but there was a storm brewing right in the heart of the dining room. It happened swiftly. Brian, her 30-year-old brother, dressed in a crisp suit, and wearing an unnerving calmness, turned to her mid-conversation, interrupting their father with one cutting sentence. "It's time for you to move out." The words dropped like a judge's gavel. Utensils froze midair. Evelyn's niece Emma, only 6, glanced up from her plate, while Melanie, her sister-in-law, quickly averted her gaze, clearly aware this moment had been planned. Evelyn didn't respond right away. She blinked as though checking to be sure she'd heard him right. Her heart picked up speed as every pair of eyes turned toward her, waiting. No one expected a confrontation on Christmas, certainly not one so public, deliberate, and absolute. But to Brian, this wasn't just a statement, it was a calculated strike. Her parents, Frank and Debbie, sat in stunned silence. Her father, always the quiet type, avoided eye contact. Her mother forced a brittle smile, trying in vain to lighten the mood. But the warmth had already left the room. Evelyn inhaled deeply, her eyes landing on the red holiday tablecloth her mother reserved for special occasions. The crystal glasses, the silver forks, the fine china, each detail reminded her that this house used to feel like home. Now it felt like a courtroom, and she was on trial. "What did you say?" she finally asked, quiet but steady. "You heard me?" Brian replied, his tone icy. 8 months is long enough. It's time to grow up. Time to be independent. It wasn't the first time Evelyn had heard something like that, but never this openly. Over the past months, she'd returned home after a painful breakup and a sudden layoff. She'd done what she could: job interviews, household chores, chipping in on utilities. But to Brian, it was never enough. Evelyn glanced at her mother, hoping for a defense, some pushback. Instead, she was met with frozen shock. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, being slowly pushed with no one reaching out to pull her back. Her hands clenched beneath the table to hide the trembling. She never imagined being told to leave, especially not by someone who once shared Legos and snow days with her. Someone who used to be her brother. That Christmas night, the twinkling lights lost their glow. Bing Crosby's soft crooning about a white Christmas no longer sounded warm, it echoed like something from a world Evelyn had been quietly written out of. But right then, Evelyn realized something with unshakable clarity. Everything was about to change, and so was she. At first glance, the Carter family looked like any other middle-class American household, a modest 2-story wood frame home on a quiet street in suburban Ohio, a well-trimmed lawn, and an old Ford pickup in the driveway. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect exterior were decades of layered emotions, resentment, quiet rivalry, and deeply ingrained family roles that had never truly been renegotiated. Frank Carter. Evelyn's father was 67 and a man of few words. He had spent 40 years under the hood of cars as a mechanic, fixing what was broken with his hands and rarely expressing emotion out loud. His love language wasn't words, it was actions. He showed he cared by checking your tire pressure, not by asking how your day was. For Frank, doing always mattered more than saying. Her mother, Debbie Carter, 64, had been an elementary school teacher before retiring. She was the peacemaker of the family. With her warm voice and gentle smile, she acted as a buffer between personalities, always ready with a cup of tea and hopeful phrases like, "Give it time or things will work themselves out." But Debbie's calmness had a shadow side. It made her conflict avoidant. When faced with tension, she'd rather ignore it and pray it past than face it head on. Then there was Brian, Evelyn's older brother, confident, sharp, and sometimes too sharp. At 30, he worked in sales at a car dealership, a job that trained him to be persuasive, assertive, and relentlessly goal-driven. Brian had always carried a quiet chip on his shoulder. When Evelyn was born 4 years after him, he felt the spotlight shift. Though their parents loved them both, Brian believed Evelyn was the favorite, the one who could do no wrong. She was the baby of the family, daddy's little girl. He was the one expected to be responsible. The resentment wasn't open. It lived in small things. The way Brian's jaw clenched when Dad drove Evelyn to school. The way he skipped out on her birthday parties as a teenager. The way he insisted on being the man of the house even when no one asked him to be. Later, Brian married Melanie, a kind woman who worked part-time at a daycare, and they had 2 young children, Emma and Lucas. The 4 of them lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment, tight on space, tighter on money. But Brian wore his struggle like a badge of honor. If I can figure it out, he'd often say so, can she? To him, Evelyn's return home after her breakup and layoff wasn't a reset, it was a retreat. A failure to launch. He didn't see a sister trying to rebuild. He saw a reminder that he never got to fall apart. He saw her sitting at their childhood dinner table, and it felt like something had been taken from him. The tension hadn't started on Christmas. It had started the moment Evelyn walked back through the front door 8 months ago, but no one had said anything until now. Frank and Debbie didn't say anything because they were happy to have their daughter home. Melanie didn't say anything because she understood how easily her husband got riled up. Evelyn didn't say anything because she was grateful and didn't want to be a burden. But Brian had been counting the days, and everyone else's silence had been the perfect breeding ground for a storm he'd been waiting to unleash. Evelyn Carter's life didn't collapse all at once. It unraveled quietly, layer by layer, like a wall slowly soaked through by rain, until one day it just crumbled beyond repair. It started with Jake Preston, her boyfriend of 4 years. Evelyn had believed they would marry. She had pictured the proposal, the white picket fence, the quiet shared life. But on a March evening, while searching through old photos to print for Jake's birthday gift, she stumbled across flirtatious messages between him and a female coworker. She didn't cry, not right away. A chill passed through her like ice water poured down her spine. When she confronted Jake, he didn't deny it. He simply said, "I didn't think you'd find out. But if you know, maybe this just needs to end." It wasn't just betrayal. It was dismissal. Casual. Final. It told her not only that he had lied, but that she wasn't worth the truth. 2 weeks later, while still reeling, Evelyn received an email from the marketing firm she'd worked at for 3 years. Due to budget cuts, her department was eliminated. No tearful goodbye. No thank you card. Just a sterile subject line, restructuring notification, and a link to unemployment benefits. In less than a month, Evelyn lost both her relationship and her career. She couldn't afford her apartment alone. Her roommate moved on, and her friends, all busy, all dealing with their own stuff, slowly faded. She who had once thought herself independent and grounded suddenly felt like a child adrift at sea. Eventually, with no other option, she made the call. Her mother, Debbie Carter, answered on the 3rd ring. Evelyn barely managed Mom, before her voice cracked into tears. "Come home," her mother said without hesitation. "Your room is still here, and we're always waiting for you." So Evelyn returned to Cedar Ridge, to her childhood bedroom with lavender wallpaper and a creaky old desk. At first, she felt ashamed. then relieved, then unexpectedly safe. Here she didn't have to pretend. She could cry behind closed doors, be quiet for hours, start over piece by piece. Her father Frank said little, but he greeted her with a firm hand squeeze on her first day back and checked her tire pressure the next morning. That was his way of saying, "I'm glad you're here." Evelyn wasn't one to freeload. She pitched in for groceries, cooked dinners, cleaned, and picked up freelance website gigs. She sent out dozens of job applications weekly, but the job market was brutal, and no one hires based on kindness and effort alone. There were nights she stayed up till 2 a.m., rewriting her resume for the 5th time. Mornings when she couldn't find the energy to get out of bed. But she kept going step by step, no matter how small. Her parents never complained. Her mom would bake her favorite chocolate chip cookies and accidentally leave a plate on the counter. Her dad always left an empty seat beside him at the dinner table, the one Evelyn had claimed since she was 12. Only Brian didn't see it that way. To him, Evelyn's return was proof of her failure, and a constant reminder that he crammed into a 2-bedroom apartment with 2 kids was trying harder. He didn't see her rejection emails. He didn't hear her 2 a.m. sobs. He only saw that she was still home, still protected. And that quiet resentment, it grew louder with every day she didn't leave. When Evelyn moved back in with her parents in Cedar Ridge, the first few weeks felt surprisingly calm. She helped with chores, cooked meals, and for a while the house felt warm, like a safe place to heal from everything the world had thrown at her. But there was one thing Evelyn couldn't ignore Brian's eyes every time she entered the room. At first it was just a glance. A faint scowl when he saw her sipping coffee with Mom. A smirk when Dad complimented her casserole. But slowly those looks turned colder, more pointed, carrying with them a silent accusation. "You don't belong here." Brian didn't say it outright, but everything he did whispered it. Every sarcastic comment, every loaded joke, every passive-aggressive remark at the dinner table felt like a dart aimed at her presence. "Evelyn's the new head chef around here, huh? Wow, baking now must be nice to have all that free time. Guess when you're not paying rent, you can really perfect those chocolate chip cookies." The tone was light. The message was sharp. Evelyn smiled through it, stayed silent. But each line was a paper cut to her pride. Her parents tried to deflect, pretending not to hear. Debbie would offer more juice. Frank would reach for the remote. But Evelyn knew they felt the tension too. They just didn't want to face it. What made things more complicated was Melanie, Brian's wife. Quiet, gentle Melanie didn't share her husband's tone. When Brian went on one of his jabs, her eyes would flick to Evelyn with something like regret. One afternoon, while Evelyn was folding laundry in the living room, Melanie sat beside her and whispered, "Don't take it personally. Brian's just stressed. Things have been tight lately." Evelyn nodded, though inside she felt a rising anger. She did understand Brian's pressure: 2 kids, a small apartment, a wife working part-time. But why take it out on her? She wasn't the reason life was hard for him, but Brian didn't see it that way. To him, Evelyn was the embodiment of unfairness, a big house, no rent time to look for the right job. He saw himself hustling to survive, and no one applauding him like they comforted Evelyn. One day during a football game, Brian casually turned to her and said, "Maybe you should just apply for a teacher's aide job or something. I mean, better than waiting around for the perfect role while living off Mom and Dad." The room went quiet. Evelyn glanced at her parents, but they looked down at their drinks. She smiled thinly. "I'm not waiting for perfection, Brian. I'm trying to choose something that'll last, not just get by." Brian shrugged cold. "Well, some of us don't have the luxury of lasting. Some of us have to get by to survive." Slowly, Evelyn realized there was no winning with Brian. If she stayed home, she was lazy. If she picked up odd jobs, it wasn't enough. If she smiled, she was fake. If she was sad, she was fishing for pity. It wasn't that she couldn't be angry, but in this family, silence had always been mistaken for strength. And she'd learned that silence was the only way to avoid war. Still, Evelyn knew one thing with growing certainty. One day this peace would shatter, and when it did, everything would change. Golden fairy lights wrapped around the staircase like constellations. The Christmas tree stood tall in the corner, its silver ornaments and glittering garland, a reminder of traditions long held. The dinner table, covered in a hand-stitched red cloth, shimmered with crystal glassware, and the honey-glazed ham sat at the center, proud, fragrant, symbolic of holiday unity. To an outsider, the Carter household looked like the perfect American Christmas, but Evelyn could feel what no one else would admit. There was something thick in the air, dense, brewing like a sky right before thunder. She'd spent the morning in the kitchen with her mother, peeling potatoes, mixing spices, layering her dad's favorite apple stuffing. Her father, Frank, usually a man of few words, had manned the oven tending to his famous ham. For a few quiet hours surrounded by cinnamon butter and Bing Crosby on the old radio, Evelyn had almost convinced herself things were okay. Almost. But then Brian walked in, and the mood shifted. Unlike previous years, he wasn't grumbling about traffic or pretending cheerfulness. He walked in with purpose, polished, controlled. His eyes didn't just pass over Evelyn, they locked onto her, steady and evaluating. Melanie, his wife, followed behind baby Lucas in her arms. She smiled briefly but avoided eye contact. Evelyn noticed she wasn't sipping wine this year. A subtle realization dawned: Melanie was pregnant. She said nothing, but something in Melanie's body language, tight shoulders, downcast eyes, said, "Not tonight. Please, not tonight." At dinner, the family gathered with familiar rituals. Debbie introduced each dish with pride, and Frank nodded approvingly at the roast. But suddenly Brian spoke up. "Mind if I say grace tonight?" A pause swept the table. Frank usually led the prayer, but Debbie smiled. "Of course, sweetheart." Evelyn looked up. Brian folded his hands and began, voice steady and clear. "Lord, thank you for family, for love, and for support during temporary challenges. Grant us the wisdom to know when help becomes enabling." Every word landed like a tap of a gavel. He wasn't praying, he was performing, and the audience was clearly Evelyn. The moment the prayer ended, glasses clinked softly, but the warmth had drained. Evelyn's throat felt dry despite the water in front of her. Throughout the meal, Brian sprinkled comments seemingly innocent but barbed underneath. "Mashed potatoes are great. Guess that much kitchen time's paying off. This stuffing's just like Mom's. Well, Evelyn's had time to perfect it lately." Each word was dipped in sweetness, then laced with poison. Evelyn heard it. So did Melanie, who kept her eyes on the kids or the casserole dish like she wished her husband would stop. Frank said nothing, but Evelyn saw his jaw clench. Debbie laughed too quickly, changing subjects like a hostess, desperately holding a crumbling dinner party together. Evelyn didn't bite back. She didn't flinch. But inside she knew. Brian hadn't come for dinner. He came to start something. Dinner was happening, or at least everyone was pretending it was. Laughter, felt hollow silverware clinked like distant echoes, and Evelyn found herself focused on slicing her green beans into perfect, meaningless pieces just to have something to do with her hands. But the moment arrived, uninvited but inevitable. Brian set down his knife and looked directly at her. His tone was casual, like commenting on the weather. "So, Evelyn, you've been here quite a while now, haven't you?" The question floated in the air, deceptively light, but Evelyn felt the chill underneath. She steadied herself. "About 8 months. Time flies." Brian smiled and added, "Some people need to learn to stand on their own 2 feet. Independence is key to growth." The tension snapped tight. Melanie placed her hand gently on Brian's arm, attempting to pivot. "Hey, why don't we talk about something else?" The kids were excited to tell their Christmas stories. Frank cleared his throat. His voice was low and firm. "Brian, it's Christmas. Let's enjoy dinner as a family." But Brian wasn't backing down. If anything, the mild pushback emboldened him. Debbie offered mashed potatoes with a forced smile. "Evelyn made these. They're delicious." Brian chuckled dryly. "Well, she's had plenty of time to practice." Each sentence sliced through the air, polished and pointed. Evelyn kept her tone even. "I contribute. I pay for some utilities. I cook clean and I'm job hunting. I'm not freeloading." Brian let out a humorless laugh. "Your share." "You're living in a 4-bedroom house with a 2-car garage and a finished basement. What do you think your share really is?" His voice rose slightly. The warmth in the room drained. The Christmas music in the background felt jarring now, cheerful lyrics cutting through an atmosphere gone cold. Frank set his fork down harder than necessary. "That's enough, Brian. This isn't the time or place." But Brian shot back. "Then when she's 30 and still living in her childhood room, when you're in your 70s, still supporting a grown daughter." The blow landed. Evelyn's face flushed. Her throat tightened. "I've had 3 interviews this month," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "I'm trying to rebuild. I don't want to settle for a job I'll regret." Brian raised an eyebrow. "Some people don't have the luxury to choose. While you're being picky, Mom and Dad are footing the bill." Melanie tried again, her voice gentle. "Brian, the kids are getting scared." And they were. Little Emma had stopped eating, clutching her napkin. Lucas was hiding in her lap. Still, Brian continued turning to his daughter like he was teaching her a life lesson. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults have to make hard decisions. Being responsible means taking care of yourself." Debbie spoke softly, her voice trembling. "Evelyn is always welcome here. She's our daughter. She's going through a difficult time." Brian responded instantly. 8 months of difficulty. While Melanie and I cram into a tiny apartment and Mom and Dad host a full-grown adult for free. Silence. Evelyn realized in that moment this wasn't dinner. This was a trial. And Brian had cast himself as judge, jury, and executioner. The room had fallen silent after Brian's last jab. The scent of cinnamon and honey still lingered faintly in the air, but no one at the table could taste Christmas anymore. Evelyn sat motionless, her hands limp in her lap, staring down at her plate gone cold. Then Brian leaned back in his chair, folded his arms across his chest, the posture of someone settling into control. His voice now lacked sarcasm. It was cool, rehearsed, and deliberate. "Since we're all here today, I think it's time we addressed what no one wants to say out loud. Evelyn, you can't keep living here indefinitely. This situation is affecting the entire family." Evelyn felt like the air had been sucked from the room. Her limbs were numb. Her heart pounded in her ears. She tried to steady herself, forcing the question. "What do you mean?" Brian leaned in slightly, eyes unwavering. "I mean, you have 1 week to move out." The words hit like a thunderclap. Debbie dropped her spoon. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Brian," Frank stared, momentarily speechless. Even Melanie turned to her husband, stunned. "What did you just say?" But Brian only looked at Evelyn. That familiar smug smile, the one he used as a kid when he got her in trouble, curled at the corners of his lips. "I've already looked into some apartments," he continued, voice sugar-coated. "There are a few affordable places. Nothing fancy but clean, safe. Good enough to get you started." The condescension made Evelyn feel ill. He was speaking to her like a college freshman, not a 26-year-old woman who had lived independently for nearly a decade. She turned to her parents, silently pleading for them to intervene. But they just sat there, frozen, shocked. And their silence cut deeper than Brian's words. That silence, it felt like abandonment. She felt herself slipping into old patterns, back into the role of the little girl who got blamed, while Brian watched smugly from the sidelines. Her voice trembled but was firm. This isn't your decision to make. Brian tilted his head, eyes sharp. Then whose is it, Mom and Dad's? The same people who are too soft-hearted to set boundaries? Maybe it's time someone made the hard choice. Frank finally spoke, his voice rough with frustration. This is our house. Evelyn is our daughter. And who lives here is our decision, not yours. Brian hesitated, then recovered quickly. He had expected this. Of course, Dad. Ultimately, it's your call. I'm just pointing out what everyone knows, but no one wants to say this arrangement doesn't work anymore. People are making sacrifices while she refuses to move forward. Debbie murmured, Maybe we can talk about this after dinner. In private. Brian shook his head. No, we've danced around it long enough. 1 week. That's fair. It's not sudden, but it creates urgency. Evelyn stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She couldn't sit there another second. Her chest felt like it was caving in. Brian snapped as she rose. Sit down. We're not finished. For a split second, she almost obeyed an instinct left over from childhood. But she met his gaze steady now and realized he didn't have power here. Not anymore. As Brian repeated the words 1 week, his voice rang out like a gavel. Evelyn stood frozen in the dining room, her heart pounding the air thick with shock and judgment. Around her, her parents remained speechless. Even Melanie was pale. But something stirred inside Evelyn, a shift like a thread pulling her backward through memory. And then it came, a memory so sharp, so vivid it stopped her breath. She was 18, sitting in her grandmother Eleanor Walker's living room. Sunlight poured through the lace curtains, and the old rocking chair creaked as Eleanor patted the cushion beside her. Come sit with me, sweetheart. I have something important to tell you. At the time, Evelyn had barely listened. Her mind was full of college plans, dorm rooms, and dreams of freedom. But Eleanor had pressed a small slip of paper into her palm anyway. This is the combination to our safe, she whispered. If one day you find yourself needing your own place, truly needing it, remember where it is. Evelyn had tucked the paper into a diary and never thought of it again. Until now, that long-forgotten moment buried beneath years of life and noise returned like lightning. Her pulse raced. Her feet moved before her brain caught up. She turned from the table. Brian called out sharp and commanding, Evelyn, we're not finished. Sit down. But she was already walking away from his voice, away from his version of the truth. Up the stairs, each step shaky but purposeful, like something larger was guiding her. She entered her parents' bedroom, opened the closet, and gently pushed aside her father's old work jackets. There it was, a small gray safe, half-hidden, collecting dust. Her hands trembled as she keyed in the numbers 102338, her grandmother's birthday. Click! The door swung open. Inside were old bank statements, jewelry boxes, and tucked between folders an aged cream-colored envelope marked in delicate script for Evelyn. Her breath caught. She opened it carefully. Inside was a crisp legal document. Official transfer of ownership for property located at 1247 Maple Avenue from Eleanor Margaret Walker and William Charles Walker to Evelyn Grace Carter, effective on her 18th birthday. Evelyn froze. This house, her childhood home, the place where she was now being told to leave, legally belonged to her. Eleanor had seen this moment before anyone else. She had known that Evelyn might one day be pushed to the edge, and she had left behind a key, not just to the house, to freedom, to dignity, to power Evelyn didn't even know she held. Tears welled in her eyes, not from sadness, but from something deeper, something closer to relief. Her grandmother had never abandoned her. She had simply trusted Evelyn to remember who she was when it mattered most. Now with the deed in hand, Evelyn understood. She hadn't come back to ask for shelter. She had returned to her own home. The paper still clutched in her hand, Evelyn descended the stairs, each step heavier than the last. Family photos lined the wall beside her: birthdays, graduations, Christmases long past. But today they felt different. This wasn't just her parents' house anymore, it was her house. Every moment captured in those frames now belonged to something she owned, not just remembered. As she re-entered the dining room, the room fell quiet again. All eyes turned to her. Brian still stood beside Dad's chair like some self-declared commander. Her parents looked stunned. Melanie was soothing the children who had grown visibly distressed. Evelyn didn't speak right away. She simply walked to the table and placed the property deed neatly and deliberately beside Brian's untouched slice of apple pie. Time stopped. "Actually, Brian," she said in a calm, controlled tone, "I have an update on the whole moving out plan. I think everyone will want to hear it." Brian raised an eyebrow, puzzled. He glanced down at the document with casual indifference until his eyes caught the title. Then he froze. His eyebrows knit together. He picked it up, scanned the page, and then read it again. The smugness drained from his face. "What is this?" he asked, voice lower now. "It's the property deed," Evelyn replied evenly. "Grandma Eleanor and Grandpa William transferred this house into my name on my 18th birthday 8 years ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The cheerful music had long since faded. The clink of silverware was gone. Only the truth remained printed in black and white right in front of them. Her parents stared at the page, their faces slowly shifting from confusion to recognition. Their expressions said it all they remembered. Brian turned the document over as if the back might change what the front declared, but the signatures were clear. The notary seal was unmistakable. This can't be real," he muttered. "Oh, it's very real," Evelyn replied. "And as for your little 1-week deadline, consider this my response." She didn't need to raise her voice. The document spoke for her louder than any defense ever could. Brian looked to his parents, desperate now. "Did you two know about this? That she's owned the house this whole time?" Frank rubbed his forehead, weariness washing over his features. "We knew Eleanor and William had made some arrangements. But with her illness then, the funeral, we let it slip away." Debbie nodded slowly, voice barely above a whisper. "She asked us not to say anything until Evelyn needed it. She said Evelyn would know when the time was right." Brian was no longer the confident older brother. He looked like a man who just walked into a room expecting applause and found a mirror instead. "You kept this hidden," he snapped. "You wanted to embarrass me." Evelyn met his eyes, calm, unwavering. "I didn't hide it to hurt you. I was trying to be a sister, not a landlord. But today you forced my hand." Her voice didn't tremble. Her hands didn't shake. For the first time that night, she wasn't defending herself, she was standing her ground. And everyone knew it. The silence in the dining room was deafening. No one moved. The paper in Brian's hands trembled slightly as he stared at it, like if he blinked hard enough the words might disappear. But they didn't. His illusion had shattered. The brother who had spent the evening casting Evelyn as a burden now stood exposed, outmaneuvered by the sister he thought was powerless. His voice cracked as he tried to regain control. "You knew about this the whole time, and you didn't say anything. You let me look like a fool in front of everyone." Evelyn didn't flinch. Her voice was even measured. "I never used this deed as a weapon. I never wanted to. I didn't want to own this family, I wanted to belong to it." That landed harder than any shout. Frank, quiet until now, cleared his throat. His voice carried weight. "Brian, you owe your sister an apology." Debbie nodded, her voice steadier than before. "Evelyn has lived here with grace and respect in her own home. She never once lorded that over us. But the way you spoke to her tonight, that was shameful." Brian looked around the room, searching for support. No one met his eyes. Even Melanie, usually his buffer, looked away. The rage in Brian's face flared, then faded. His shoulders sagged. "Fine. I might have been too harsh. But I still stand by what I said. Owning a house doesn't mean you're an adult. You can't live off inherited property forever. Evelyn looked at him not with anger but clarity. I'm not living off anything, but when you try to kick someone out of their own home, sometimes they have to remind you they belong. It was a turning point not just in the conversation but in Evelyn herself. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was leading. She turned to her parents. If you both still want to live here, I'd love that. This house is still your home too. But from now on, things need to be honest, no more silence, no more pretending. We have to face things together. Frank took Debbie's hand, then looked at Evelyn not just with affection but with respect. Brian didn't respond. He simply rose, motioned for his wife and children. No slamming doors, no final words, just quiet defeat and the beginning of self-awareness. After Brian left with his family, the house fell quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. Not the silence of tension. This was the silence of something ending and something beginning. Evelyn stood by the living room window, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea her mother had brewed earlier. The Christmas lights in the front yard still blinked softly, but her gaze wasn't distant anymore. She didn't feel like a guest or a problem to be solved. She was standing in her home, and for the first time she felt like she owned her place not just on paper, but in presence. Behind her, her mother approached quietly. Debbie's eyes were still a little red. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she said softly. Your dad and we should have remembered the deed. We should have stopped this sooner. Evelyn turned, placing a reassuring hand on her mom's shoulder. It's okay, Mom. Honestly, I think maybe it had to happen. I needed to learn how to speak up, not just survive. Frank sat down across from them, his face thoughtful, his voice low. We're proud of you for standing up for yourself, and if you want to make changes now, it's your house. We'll respect that. The words caught Evelyn off guard. Not because of what they meant legally, but because of what they meant emotionally. He saw her. He acknowledged her. Not just as a daughter, but as a grown woman. I don't want to change everything she said, but I do need to set some boundaries. Not to push anyone away, just to make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes. And so on Christmas night, while most people were settling in for dessert, the three of them sat down for their first real conversation as equals. Evelyn proposed she would convert one of the spare rooms into her own private office and bedroom space her sanctuary. She would take full responsibility for utilities and household expenses going forward. Her parents would no longer carry the burden. Most importantly, conflicts would be addressed with real conversations, not sarcasm at dinner, not buried resentment. Debbie nodded, tears glistening, but this time from relief. Frank simply said, That sounds fair. Evelyn looked around the house, once a childhood haven, then a place of shame, then a battlefield. Now it was something else entirely, a beginning. She didn't need permission to exist here anymore. She had claimed her space not with anger, not with paperwork, but with her voice. 6 months after that Christmas night, the house on Maple Avenue no longer felt like a container for the past. It had become a launch pad for the future. Evelyn Carter was no longer the woman standing at the threshold asking to stay. Now she was the one opening the door, but only to those who brought respect, honesty, and mutual regard. The living room had been rearranged to host small meetings for the nonprofit she'd recently joined, where she led communications and outreach strategies. Her old bedroom had been transformed into a cozy workspace, complete with a cactus on the windowsill and a vision board filled with ideas for future campaigns. And each morning she brewed coffee for her parents, not as someone needing care, but as a partner in shared adult life with the two people who had raised her. Her relationship with Frank and Debbie had shifted too. No longer were they caretakers or enforcers, they were companions, equals. They spoke more openly, listened more deeply, and when disagreements came, they faced them with conversation, not quiet resentment. As for Brian, the relationship remained distant. But it was no longer a distance defined by fear, it was a boundary rooted in self-respect. Evelyn didn't avoid him, but she also no longer let him into places he used to invade her self-worth, her peace, her narrative. At family gatherings, she greeted him with polite calm, nothing more. And something curious happened. He changed. Not dramatically, not with apologies, but he softened. He stepped back, and he even on occasion asked about their parents with sincerity he hadn't shown before. Evelyn no longer wished for a perfect family. She just wanted one where her value wasn't up for debate. 1 year after that infamous dinner, Evelyn hosted Christmas herself, not as the girl on trial, but as the woman at the head of the table. The dishes were laid out by her hand not to impress, but to share. The guests who sat around her table weren't there out of obligation. They had chosen to be there. The house was no longer a refuge from failure. It was a foundation for growth. A place Evelyn had reclaimed not just in name, but in spirit. And this time she wasn't just surviving in it. She was thriving on her own terms.